Welcome to this episode of Questioning Behaviour.
And today we are actually questioning the behaviour of the pain of paying.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't believe in science.
As our money resident behavioural expert, Merle, can you give us an idea of what on earth the pain of paying actually is?
So, for the sake of the introduction and not to completely outdo the actual expert that we're going to interview, I'll make it very, very brief. My entire dissertation is actually on the pain of paying, and the pain of paying is actually a relatively simple concept where if you actually engage in a transaction and you try to obtain a good or a service, you will have to pay for it. And it is the process of paying that the pain of paying unironically focuses on, but the pain is associated with all the negative emotions that occur when you're actually handing over money. Now, the handing over of money can be very physical, such as seen with cash, or a lot less physical, as seen with debit and credit cards, or even completely contactless, which is also seen with cards and mobile payments. And the latter is what my entire dissertation focuses on. But yeah, that's the pain of paying. All negative emotions experienced during the payment process.
Very cool. So I guess this is something a lot of people will have personal experience with.
So the pain of paying is a theory come up with or fleshed out by Ofer Zellermayer, who is, spoiler alert, the expert of the upcoming episode and the upcoming interview. He wrote this in 1996, and there were a few less payment methods by then, but of course the most prominent were check, cash, debit, and credit card. So what actually was done in this case is that he built a spectrum for which payment method was the most painful and which payment method was the least painful, based on categorizations of how coupled, how transparent, and how physical these payment methods were. So cash, of course, scores high on all these, given that cash is very physical, you have to hand it over physically, is very transparent. The value of cash is directly reflected on the cash. What you get back cash-wise is now what you have left, so it's very clear. And the decoupling refers to the payment being concurrent with the actual obtaining of the good or service. So as soon as I want to buy something with cash, I have to give over the cash directly, and then I get the good or service. It's not as seen with a credit card where I tap or swipe or whatever you do with a credit card, and then the actual payment is deducted at the end of the month if that is my credit card repayment scheme. So these things are actually very, very different. I do think everyone has experience with this for the sheer sake that everyone has made payments. I think everyone knows what it's like to handle cash. I think most people have a debit card. I think a lot of people, especially our generation and younger, have mobile payments. And I think most people will have a credit card, whether that is a positive thing or not.
Yeah, and something, that we're going to dig down a little deeper into is what the actual consequences are for consumer experience, for self-control, for people being able to manage their finances effectively as we move towards a more decoupled world.
Well, the thing that you see is, of course, that contactless is still either a function enabled on a card or enabled on a mobile phone. Now, there is very little known about what a continuous usage of a mobile phone as a payment device actually does. I think it's because it's relatively new, and of course, academic research is relatively slow for obvious reasons. When it comes to contactless cards, in the first study I ran in the PhD, we do see that there is a difference between how accurately you can recall the expenditure that you just made. But the irony is that compared to cash, a contactless card is worse, so your recall is worse. The second most accurate recall is done with the contactless mobile payments, so mobile doesn't seem to be that bad. And the worst recall you actually get if you have a PIN-verified card. So contactless is somewhere in the middle on the spectrum, but that's only for immediate expenditure recall. So the rest of my research looks more into whether you hit overdraft fees, whether you get in debt quicker or are more likely to get into debt. And that research is still a bit hush-hush. So I hope to actually have results on that by the summer. I'll keep you posted. If anyone wants to know, just reach out via the socials. I'll let you know once I have something.
Yeah, I can't wait to read it. But yeah, I guess this is a good time to introduce our expert. Today we have Ofer Zellermayer joining us to talk about the pain of paying, his own research, how he got into research, and just to have a chat with us about how the pain of paying affects people's relationships with their money and what the future of money might look like.
And our expert of today is, if I pronounce this correctly, and hopefully I do, Ofer Zellermayer. Probably better if you pronounce it and if you introduce yourself. So please tell us, who are you?
If we are in the United States or England, it's Ofer Zellermayer, as you said, and the actual way to pronounce it is Zellermayer because the origin is German. I am now in Israel, where I was born. I split my professional time between academia and the real world. I've been doing this for the last almost 30 years now. Ski is a passion of mine. I'm trying to get at least 20 days of skiing a year.
Amazing.
It's not very easy when you live in the Middle East and we only have one mountain here that operates in a good year for a week or two. So I spend a lot of time in Austria and Italy and France, of course, not now. And when I studied in the US, I skied there a lot. I'm married with 3 daughters and therefore I'm a feminist.
Very nice. Very nice.
That's basically me.
We do like a feminist here.
Yes, we love a supporter of the cause.
Yeah, and actually some of them are making noise now in the other room because it's Corona time and, it's all professional life and private life is all mixed now, and that's part of the times.
Yeah. So no skiing for the foreseeable future.
None.
Unfortunately, the only thing I'm counting on is that Austria, they will have to open really soon because Austria with no ski is like, I don't know, England with no beer or no soccer.
No.
So they will have to
my
open.
gosh.
They will have to
That's
open
a
it.
post-apocalyptic nightmare, I can tell you.
Calm down. For all the
Riots
British
in the
listeners,
streets.
please calm down.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So how did you get into behavioral science?
Okay, it's actually quite an interesting story. I'll give a bit of a background. In Israel, almost every person when finishing the military duty, which we all do here, girls go for at least 2 years, boys go for at least 3. I did quite a bit more. When we finish the army service, we often go to tour the world on what's called here the big trip, and that takes a while. I did it for more than a year. A friend of mine and myself, we rented a VW bus. We actually started in the Netherlands. We converted it into a sleeping bus and we traveled through Europe. And when we ran out of money, I found myself working in the US in a car that was doing, there was a call center, and I tried to close the sales. And then I started to get interested in the business and psychology aspects of how to make business, what makes people want to buy something, and things like that. At the same time, my parents got worried about me becoming a person who's just going to spend his time traveling around the world. So they said, you have to go back to school. So I told them just enroll me in the most difficult departments, and I found myself doing a double major in business and psychology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It was an excellent time back then. A lot of people who later became famous for doing research were building their career there, and I was lucky to work with as a research assistant of Professor Gershon Ben Shachar. His nickname is Zero, and I worked on lie detectors theory that's called guilty knowledge technique, and I did some work with Professor Gary Bornstein on group dilemmas, and I took a class in psychology and law with Professor Maya Bar Hillel. Maya is quite well known for behavioral decision sciences. And at one day, she just invited as a guest lecturer a person that back then I didn't know, I did not even hear of. His name was Amos Tversky.
How times have changed. How times have changed.
Looking back in retrospect, I can say that was a seminal moment, or perhaps the seminal moment of my career. When he finished his talk, I approached him, a young undergrad student, second year. I asked him, Professor Tversky, can you please let me know where I can study or learn deeply the stuff that you just talked about? And he took a piece of paper, just a napkin, and he wrote down names of 10 schools, 8 in the States and 2 in England. And he said, just try to enroll. And if one of them says yes, just go there. So I wrote to all of them. Back then, no internet, no nothing, just mail cost.
Snail mail. Great.
It cost $1,000. The reason was that if you were from Israel and some other countries, that they suspected you that you're going to forfeit recommendation letters. So everything was to be certified, registered, and I did all these processes, and I did the GRE, and I wrote to business schools and to other places. And the best place that accepted me was Carnegie Mellon University. And basically I said, sure, I'm going to come. Because the Israeli school year ends in August and the one in the US starts in August, my third year was in Israel. Back then was very hectic. So I basically finished, took a flight and went to Pittsburgh, and that's how back then we called it BDT. Now they changed the name they have all these different names now, behavioral economics and on and so forth. But back then it was behavioral decision sciences or behavioral decision theory. And I found myself in the only department in the world back then and now as well, that's a department dedicated to decision sciences. And that's the Social and Decision Sciences at Carnegie Mellon University.
Wow. Well, if Amos Tversky tells you to go study behavioral sciences, you go study behavioral science, right?
Well, no, Amos Tversky gave a fascinating talk. And that's what made me decide that I want this topic. He just told me where to go. And
right.
I was lucky
That's
enough.
not advice to take lightly. That is not advice.
And I was lucky enough to get accepted.
But it's not just Amos Tversky, who is an absolutely huge name, who actually played a very important role in your life, or if you would even say your career, because you went to do your PhD with the man, the myth, the legend, George Loewenstein. Where for people that, that are listening to this, and for behavioral scientists, whether academic or non-academic, who George is. So I'm quite curious, what was your experience like working with someone as huge as George Loewenstein? What was that like?
When I came to Carnegie Mellon, I actually didn't know George Loewenstein. Not because I was, or not only because I was an ignorant, clueless from Israel.
No, that's not what I'm saying here.
but because George Loewenstein was not the huge name and the myth that he is now. He was an up-and-coming star. Actually, I joined SDS in 91. George only got his full professorship in 92. So when I arrived, of course, he was as bright. And the myth was starting to be built because, as you may or may not know, George is the grandson of Freud. Have you known that?
It says that on Wikipedia, but every single time, does he actually acknowledge that?
It does acknowledge that, yeah.
Okay.
So,
wow.
But back then I did not know, and the reason I actually came to the department is because of other people. So. It's amazing. It was back then, and I think still is, amazing department that's very interdisciplinary with a lot of interaction. I mean, you walk in the corridors and you just meet people such as Robin Dawes. Robin was actually the first one that became well-known, except for, Tversky and Kahneman. He wrote in 88 a book called Rational Choice in an Uncertain World. So I think you can say that he was the first person. Now there are tons of books like that, but he was the first person that took this excellent and fascinating area and made a more popular book out of it. He later on wrote a book called House of Cards about the myths in psychology and psychotherapy and all the problems that these cause. And there was Baruch Fischoff. Actually, I came to work with Baruch Fischoff. He was back then well known. He was a student of Tversky and Kahneman, and he did an amazing work about the hindsight bias. And there was Mark Hamlet in public policy, and Stephen Klepper in economics, and Sarah Kistler, who was huge in organizational behavior, and of course Herb Simon, the legend of bounded rationality.
Yes.
And all these people I knew of, and once I arrived there, they were just very approachable. And I got into this. I started being a TA. I actually was a TA of Robin Does. We had huge classes, so Robin was in charge of a 500 students class, split into four professors, and I worked with one of those professors. And only during my second year, when I took an advanced seminar in behavioral decision sciences, I actually learned about George, because this second seminar was with George. We were only a few students in the class, if I remember correctly, 8 or 10, PhD seminar, and I just fell in love with the work that George was doing. And I basically convinced the department and the other people that I want to work with George. And I a little bit shifted my interest from work on risk analysis into the work on that George was doing, more intertemporal choice, stuff like that. And
So, what was working with George Lowenstein like? Apparently, before he became the myth.
yeah, so George, I think the first thing I have to say, was very generous. He was generous with his time. Completing a PhD in a top US school, and I can attest for Carnegie Mellon, is a very enriching experience, because you really feel that the professors want you to succeed, that they push you very hard, but they give you the tools. And George was always accessible, very curious. I mean, we spent a lot of time out of the office. As a PhD student, my work day looked as follows. I would wake up around 7 a.m. in the morning and read the Wall Street Journal. The reason I did this was because another professor that was on my committee, Paul Fishbeck, told us, all PhD students, he said, if you really want to be good researchers, you have to understand where you live. And the best way to do this was to read the Wall Street Journal. For me, it was also a very good English lesson. So I would start the day this way and then walk through the park, Shentley Park, to the university, about 20 minutes walk, where I would think about research, then sit in the office for 10 hours and work, and then walk back home, basically break the day by watching half an hour of Married with Children, and then read papers for 2 hours, then go play squash and racquetball for 2 hours, and then go back home, study more, and go to sleep. And at one point, either I found out that George was also a keen player of squash, or he found that about me. I actually don't remember who discovered whom. And we started playing together. So we had a lot of office hours together. And the thing is, George was always at work. So even as we played, he was very competitive, but between points, he spoke research. And when we drove together to the courts, he spoke research. And it was not always the direct research question that we worked on while in the office, but some things were really kind of off the spectrums. Things about India, things about, I don't know, how to measure sex enjoyment, things like that we now he's famous enough to be able to do this without fearing the embarrassment. But back then, the questions were asked more silently, but it was still very, very interesting, and it was very enjoyable experience. The other thing that was unique to working with George was the fact that he really pushed into doing the research outside the university. Make a note of this, because if you now look in the Carnegie Mellon research, you see that they have a special bus that drives through the neighborhoods of Pittsburgh and collects data in the neighborhoods and not in the classrooms. And that's, if you think about how much information we get from students instead of getting it in the real world, it's a big thing. And George back then pushed me to doing this. So a lot of my dissertation was actually collected at the museum or in parks or in shops and things like that. It made it much more difficult, because asking people to spend time on questionnaires is more difficult than just doing things in classrooms. But that was George.
Amazing. The one question that I have is, who is the better squash player, you or George?
I don't think it's a fair question, because no, I'll tell you why. First, I'll say a few things. I am, and I was back then, quite a bit younger. So I think I had some inherent benefit in that. Second, on the other hand, George was my advisor and I had to let him win.
I see.
So it's a moral thing. I have to say that George was more competitive. So perhaps because I played so much, I played squash with George and with other players, and I played racquetball a lot. I think at that point, George, that had been playing more earlier, but at that point played less, I think he was more competitive. But it was a great time. I mean, in retrospect, if I could, invite him to play now, I would certainly do it. I think it would be a great thing. In Carnegie Mellon in general, in our department, during the springtime, every other week, we would also go everybody together and play softball. So we had a very cool atmosphere between the faculty and the PhD students, but with George, it was special.
Amazing. We talk about George Lowenstein as making a mark on the world, but you could potentially also argue that the work that you did in your PhD is still extremely relevant today.
Your work on the pain of paying, I mean, the pain of paying has never been as relevant as it is today, given the enormous amount of payment methods that keep getting introduced almost on an annual basis by this stage. Would you care to very quickly explain what is actually the pain of paying and how it applies to different payment methods?
Yes. If I go, I can read the abstract from the dissertation, but if I'm trying to look at it as in a perspective and just be very, very brief, the gist of the pain of paying, or the unique things that I did in the dissertation, is capture the visceral feeling that accompanies making a payment. I think that's in one sentence, that's the big, big thing. All the others, the other things that the dissertation talks about, a lot of people dealt with and before and after, but this was, I think, the major change that made people, and myself, but other people as well, excited, because all of a sudden, this thing that before that was related to as a technical thing now became so lively and exuberant and something that you really can relate to. I can try and give an example that will make things more clear.
Please do.
Think, for example, of memory, or the phenomenon of a memory loss. You can look at it scientifically. You can find a lot of evidence in peer review papers, and you can also find evidence in Hollywood movies. But if you really want to get the feeling, then you probably have to go to literature and look, for example, at a book written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez called 100 Years of Solitude. And in that book, Garcia Marquez describes the city of Macondo and how their people lost their memory and what happens when many people experience memory loss. And once you read this, all of a sudden memory loss becomes something much more personal and lively and understood and emotional and not so factual. With respect to memory, many did this. But if you look at the pain of paying, if you wanted to get this more colorful delineation, you had to go to the literature. For example, to read Molière, who wrote The Miser. I mean, in French, it's called L'Avare or something like this. Maybe I mispronounce it. But there was no description of the pain of paying outside this kind of poetry that actually described the emotional attachment or the emotional elements that accompany it. And my work basically changed that. All of a sudden, it was me, but all of a sudden somebody took this very concept and described it in a way that was not factual, was not technical, was not only research and data oriented, but much more feeling oriented.
Yeah, no, fair enough. It's quite difficult within some research to make clear what it is that you're actually talking about and how this is experienced in day-to-day life, because this is actually very valid research for, everyone, like every type of person, because everyone pays, everyone makes payments, and everyone uses an array of different payment methods. Now, your dissertation actually got published in 1996. I know this because I continuously reference your dissertation in my own PhD dissertation. But a lot of things have actually changed since then. Over 20 years later, actually almost 25 years later, we've actually gotten many more payment methods. So do you think the theory of the pain of paying, does this actually extend beyond the payment methods that you designed it for, if you will? And does this also work for contactless cards and smartphone payments and gadget payments? Does this theory extend to the whole new scala of payments that we have?
The short yes answer would be yes. The longer answer would be yes, but, and the long answer I'm going to explain. We have to understand that between 96 and now, in addition to what you just described in change of payment methods and all that, huge things has happened, and that's called the internet.
Yeah, of course.
And if I go back, 40 years ago, and you look at what's expected from people versus what's expected today with millennials and so forth, there is a huge change. A lot of it is because of the internet, not only, but I think the internet contributed a lot. In the past, the thing that was okay to acquire and possess was basically possession. So it was okay to buy a house. It made sense. If you bought a house, you made a rational and smart decision. If you invested in a courtyard, it was okay. Things that you can really accumulate. If you just spent money on experiences, for example, you went on a very expensive trip, unless you belong to the rich and famous, this was considered squandering money. If we look at today, it's basically the opposite. The recommendation of the people who write rational books about rationality, they tell you, forget about possessions, try to accumulate experiences. And that this is actually, it intervenes, it muddies the effect of the pain of paying on different payments. And therefore, it's a little bit difficult to make a clean comparison between now and then, because it's not only that we jumped 30 years forward in time and the payment methods have changed, the world has changed, and what's considered right and wrong has changed.
It does make a lot of sense, but if we were to keep the idea of spending as possession or spending as investment, so back into buying houses and courtyards or other things that Sarah and my generation can't afford and will never be able to buy, if we keep this as a constant for our fake world that doesn't exist, do you then think that smartphone payments and smartwatch payments, these things that are predominantly technologically driven, do you think then that do they promote more or less pain of paying?
They absolutely promote now less pain of paying because of first all the decoupling that's done, and second because it became so ubiquitous that people are just going, and when we are all using the cards, we're not even sliding them anymore. We can just put them near a device that reads them, or just put the phone near something and it reads this, and we can take it to a greater extreme. There is now Amazon Go, that you can just enter a store, you walk out, you did nothing, payment just happened. And actually, because of this, there are now remedies that are being invented, in the sense of recoupling. So some people have in their phone a system that every time a payment is made, they get an SMS, and some people actually have a special SMS that make an unpleasant sound.
Wow.
That actually tells them. My father actually has it. So he has this thing that every time a payment happens, even if it happens with a credit card or just by, it happens just like in Amazon Go and so forth, he hears this SMS that tells him, hey, a payment happened, check it out. And of course, there is a rational reason to do this, which is maybe somebody stole your card or maybe somebody overcharged you. But it also can be related to from the pain of paying perspective, because it tells you, hey, we have to do this conditioning, the Pavlovian conditioning again. Payment is not just something that happens in a funny money world. It's your money that has been taken out, and you have to reinstill the pain. Otherwise, it's being decoupled, and then It's at the individual level, it's a problem. People may overspend, and it's an issue. I mean, parenthetically, it's interesting during this time to talk about this. I don't know if you in the world now there is the corona issue, and if you follow the internet on that or Facebook, German consumers are complaining.
Lack of cash usage. Yay. So now when you said Germany, it's like the Germans are complaining, and then you mentioned Corona, and the first thing I thought about was the one thing that they're trying to stop people to do is pay by cash. And I've been to Germany plenty of times, and if there's one thing the Germans love, it's their payment by cash. They have entire supermarket chains like Aldi and Lidl where you show up with a debit or a credit card, and like the cashier is just giving you a dirty look, like it's cash or you just get out. I think it's great. Very different.
Exactly. And what's happening now is that because of this corona situation, many countries, but also many individual people are getting into economical burdens, and they are approaching their government saying, hey, help us out. We need money right now. And I read in the internet and on Facebook, for example, some German consumers, German people saying, what are you complaining about? Sometimes shit will happen. And if shit happens, you have to be ready. And it doesn't make sense that you don't have a way to support yourself without the governmental help, not for a year, but at least for 2 months. What's happening, people? So the German consumers, in a way, did not let the pain of paying escape, and they kept things more rigid. And in some other societies, with this decoupling, some people are in dire straits now.
Do you actually think that's being driven by Germany being such a cash country still? Do you genuinely think that people are better managing their personal finances because they are so cash focused?
Absolutely. No, I just want to make a comment here. I don't want to say better. Who knows what's better? More prudently.
Sure.
I'll say more prudently, because it's not a moral statement that I'm saying. I'm looking
of course.
But more prudently, absolutely.
So, but do you think that is because, which way is this going round? As in, Germans are more prudent, as such they use cash, or they use cash and as such they are more prudent?
I think it's Germans are more prudent, and as such they use cash. If I have to if I have to choose what makes things work, what is the cause and what is the reaction, I would say the cause is probably that they are more prudent and therefore they use more cash. But I think that relates to it, and I think you may want to get to this later on, but we can bring it up here, is this has to do, using cash has a lot of disadvantages. I'm a marketing professor in addition to being a decision making professor, and there is this notion in marketing that's called leakage. Have you heard of this?
Yes.
Well, could you explain?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Like I love how
For
I'm
me?
like, yes, I know exactly what it is, and my entire audience or like just being like, yeah.
So chains, department stores and so forth, they lose up to 10% of their inventory, or at least a single-digit percentage of theft or loss of inventory happens all the time. And cashless can decrease corruption. And digitization and automatization of society could have ancillary benefits. So by moving into a cashless society, corruption will definitely reduce, that's for sure. And it may have some benefits. It has drawbacks, as you just mentioned. And I don't think that cash is cure for all. In Germany, I think it works, or in German-like societies, it works well. But we have other examples that actually exemplify the opposite. What's happening now in Italy, because of the situation, in some extreme, it's not a huge phenomenon, but there is a phenomenon in some extreme cases that people who cannot afford, they lost all their money. They cannot afford to buy food. They cannot take loans anymore, so they go to the black market. And the black market in Italy is mafia. And mafia is now becoming much stronger during this corona crisis. And it's a huge issue. And if everything was cashless, then these kind of organizations would have had a more difficult time operating. So I'm not saying that paying cash, that we all have to go back to paying cash because of the benefits of paying. There are benefits and there are disadvantages as well.
I imagine that the pain of paying is going to vary across different types of transactions. Sort of, buying a house versus buying a new pair of shoes. If we're going to think about the pain of paying potentially as a tool that we can use ourselves to try and help us manage our finances, in what sort of transactions would, increasing the pain of paying benefit us, do you think?
That goes, I can answer it two ways. First, I can go back to the dissertation in which I really measured what type of expenses are more effective and which one are less. And we did all these experiments back then. And if I'm going back there, we can see that if you purchase something that you're going to use for a long time, then there is less pain of paying, and it actually makes sense. But if I'm trying to tackle it from a different perspective, then it relates to the work of Dick Taylor about mental accounting. And in the same way that we can have different accounts for different types of behaviors, we can have different mental accounts for different type of payments as well. And we can try and fool ourselves to feel more pain in cases that it will be stupid to spend the money. But I think, again, it's becoming more and more difficult because society pushes us in different ways. I mean, there's only so much that you can do with the pain of paying. Once everything is going to be automatic and everything is going to be cashless, it will be more difficult to really feel the pain. Let's go back, for more than 1400 years ago, when things were barter. So if I gave somebody my dog to get a sack of potatoes, it was very painful. If I'm giving somebody money, well, it's painful, but not as. And if I pay them with some, money in the cloud, then of course the pain is not as severe, and the way to refill it is just by those artificial mechanisms that I mentioned before.
Actually, talking about artificial mechanisms, that leads really, really nicely to the next question, because I've just managed an array of new payment methods. The newest payment method, or at least the one that's definitely rocked the classical finance system, if you will, is crypto. So think of Bitcoin, for example. How do you think this relates to the pain of paying, or how do you think people relate to this currency? Like, do they relate to this as money at all?
I actually try to think very hard about this question, and unfortunately, I do not have a perfect answer. I tried to think about it hard because about 4 or 5 years ago, a German business newspaper, had a conference about new currencies, and they interviewed me, and then I had a chance to really think about what is all this Bitcoin and stuff like that and blockchain going to do to life. And I said, let's say that you take me back to the beginning of money.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is this story that I forget whom, but a person that went to China, and he saw that the grandfather of Genghis Khan was actually using money, something that was not known in the West, or at least not well known. And it was very bizarre to him, and he couldn't think about what is this thing. And if I take myself back to that point of time, and you had asked me the question, are people going to think of money as something real, as something tangible, or is just a piece of paper, or back then maybe just a piece of metal? And I would have said probably not. Probably it's going to remain a piece of paper. But now we know that it's not the case, that actually until 50 years ago, people thought about money as something very real. If you lost $100 bill, it was really painful. And So if you ask me now and I have to answer intuitively, I would say no, Bitcoin is not going to cause any pain or almost not. But if I'm trying to give the researcher answer or the intuitive scientist answers, and I do the comparison that I just did between what happened back then to Genghis Khan and what's happening now, perhaps 400 years from now, people will feel about Bitcoins the same feelings that they have for actual dollar bills right now. So I don't have a definite answer, but that's the best I can say about it.
So once cash got recognized properly as money from a historical perspective, there was a pain of paying associated by it because you saw it as money. You saw that if you lost it, you had lost something of value. You are expecting, from a researcher perspective, that this is also likely to happen with crypto, for example, Bitcoin. If people see it as proper money, they will experience a similar type of pain of paying as with cash. However, with the credit card, which although is definitely a way of spending money, and if someone steals your credit card, they can take a lot of money from you, we don't at all see that people perceive this as money to the same extent, because what you do see with credit cards is that people do get into debt, they do spend more impulsively, they spend more often, they have a higher willingness to pay. So it seems as if, although the credit card has been around for decades now, the pain of paying hasn't at all caught up to this credit card as you would expect it to do with crypto. So what's the difference?
I think, Merle, that you're completely correct in the sense that pain of paying with cryptocurrency will never be as strong as it is with paper money, but it will be stronger, much stronger than it is now. So the
Okay.
comparison will be, as we switched from barter to money, some degree of pain of paying was lost. Giving up a sack of potatoes in order to get a sack of oranges was more painful than paying money for it. Basically, a lot of it has to do with the endowment effect. But with time, the pain of paying for money was strong enough to have a very emphasized effect. Not as strong, but strong enough. What happened with credit card, I'll get back to credit in a second, but when we talk about cryptocurrency, yeah, the effect will be smaller than with money. And with time, asymptotically, probably will be almost as strong, but never as strong, but much stronger than it is now. Credit card is a bit of a different story because they're in the 60s, they made tons of experiments about this. They actually showed that credit card encourages spending because it gives you some kind of illusory feeling of competency. So you can actually spend a lot of money and hope that it will work well for you. So they told you felt, yeah, I can go to Vegas, I'll spend with the credit cards, and then the advice would be leave the credit card in the room, just take $100 bill. And in the same sense, cryptocurrency won't be like credit card because it will not allow you to say, okay, let's spend something and see what happens. It's going to be more like a debit card. And if we can couple the expenses on a debit card to the payment, so every time you make a payment, you'll get an annoying SMS or something like this, then there will be the conditioning will occur more quickly. Otherwise, it will take a long time to actually develop.
So would you say there's just something fundamentally different about having something physical and tangible, such as in a bartering economy or in cash, as opposed to these virtual methods of payments when it comes
Yes.
to this feeling?
Yeah, I think that the feeling is the farther we get from the actual barter to something that amorphous, the pain of paying diminishes.
And if we stay in this virtual space, we can see apps such as Klarna, which are sort of trying to get people to spend more money than they might normally over a longer period of time.
To reiterate, Klarna is this buy now and pay later in separate terms. Very often, Klarna divides your expenditure in three. If you've done any online shopping lately, especially for fashion, I think Klarna is there.
And it seems like a good idea on the surface, where you're sort of paying 0% interest. Overall, you'd be spending the same amount as if you paid it all in one go. But it seems like it's just a bit of a debt trap.
Tend to agree with you that it is a debt trap. I think it's a very bad thing. I'll give you an example from another thing that I see happening here all the time. We have this system now in Israel, and I think you have it all over the world now, that supports people-to-people payment. So if I want to give you an amount of money, I don't have to do a bank transfer anymore. I don't have to send you a check. I just go on the mobile device. In Israel, it's called Bit, but there are other services in other places. You push a button and you transfer to anybody in your contacts any amount of money. It could be even $10. Now, where is the problem? Every time you make this transaction, unless you do it within your bank, they charge you. It's a very small amount of money. It's about $0.50 for any transaction. And what I saw, one day I look at my daughter's account and I see that she's using it all the time for very small amounts. $20 to a friend here, $15, and she gives money this way and she gets back. For example, they go to a restaurant, someone doesn't have money or credit card ran out, so one is paying, the other gives the money back. But at the end of the month, they are paying so much money in transaction fees. And the reason that they do it is there is no pain of paying. They don't feel it. But if every time you gave your friend in return $20, you also had to give another dollar to the bank, then you'd feel a pain of paying it, and it will not happen that much. So I do think that the payment methods that you mentioned, it's not just a debt trap. It's also kind of I don't want to say a scam, but it's another system of the big banking rather to take some more money from your pocket to theirs, and people have to be careful about it.
It's very effective, actually. It's very effective to get people, using these systems because it is so convenient. And as you said, people just they don't have that physical affective reaction to sending over the money virtually.
Absolutely. I'll give you another example. There are now very attractive credit cards in terms of, it's not very attractive now because now there are no flights. You cannot not go anywhere. But if you think a year ago or next year, there are those credit cards that allow you to accumulate miles on your favorable airline every time you use it. And I know some people who spend the money, they spend, let's say, $50, and they say, yeah, I'm going to get another 2 miles. And they're looking at the pleasure of paying because they are thinking of their next flight. And of course, if they save the $50 and just put it into buying an airline ticket, it makes much more sense, but the psychology doesn't work this way. So in that sense, the pain of paying is still alive and kicking, but I think other people are going to do the research on that.
Yeah, Merle, that's for you. That's your next project.
I'm still with contactless payment methods. I'm still with tap and go for cards and mobile phones. I think there's a lack of research there already. Let me do that first. So they're called unicorn apps because they're massive tech titans, of which Klarna is a great example. So, Ofer, do you think this is the future for paying? This constant decoupling?
Well, first I have to ask you: is Klarna a unicorn already?
Yeah, I've read an article in which they called Klarna a unicorn, so I'm quoting that now. According to me, it's a unicorn.
Okay, wow. No, unicorn, I mean, it's a company worth more than $1 billion. Wow. I didn't think Klarna was that, but I may be wrong. No, I think that the future has to be with some form of recoupling. So the more decoupling we're going to have, a solution of recoupling will have to be found. I don't know exactly how and where. I'm sure that people are not going, 100 years from now, people are not going to have credit cards. That's for sure. They're not going to carry any of those funny looking plastic stuff or anything like that, but they will have something. Let's imagine that it's just a wristwatch. that's not used to tell you the time, but it's used to make phone calls and SMSing and everything like that, and for paying. But every time you'll pay, you'll get a recoupling signal. Otherwise, there is not going to be a way that you can even control things. It's not just the pain of paying. Think about it differently. If you have money, when it runs out, it runs out. When you have a credit card, not even a debit card, a real credit card, eventually it runs out. I mean, yeah, we had the subprime issue in the United States in which people spend, 15 times their abilities, but not 150 times. At one point, it has to stop. Mm-hmm. If everything is virtual and you basically have no idea what you have and where you spend, I don't believe people will be able to adapt to it. I mean, we are not these kind of organisms. We will have to have some, just in order not to lose control, and to regain control. If the mechanism is going to be recoupling, then it's going to cause the pain of paying. If it's going to be a different mechanism, for example, every day when you come home you see a screen with your expenses, then it's going to be less of pain of paying. I tend to assume that it's going to be a mechanism with the pain of paying, but of course I'm not subjective. I want it to be this way because I wrote about it many years ago. But I think what's really interesting for research, if we're trying to be pragmatic, is what I alluded to before, that the mechanism, payment methods that actually produce pleasure of paying. So if we are going back to the 70s, 80s, Club Med introduced this token economy. So you go to a Club Med vacation, you pay in advance a lot of money. Once you get there, you're not allowed to use your wallet. You actually, at some clubs at some point, you're really not allowed to even bring it. You had to leave it in your room, and you got tokens. And people really loved those vacations because it was only pleasure. You spent all the money before, and once there, no money was spent whatsoever. Everything was just experiences. And if we are jumping 50 years forward, then imagine an affinity program that actually makes you feel very good every time you spend money. For example, every time you spend on something that contributes to your children's education, or to brings you closer to flying to a destination you really like. And this is something that I think is going to happen more now, and that needs research as well. I don't think there is enough research done about it now, and therefore, and because of this, I don't think those affinity programs are great yet, but I think they will improve.
Yeah, it's an incredibly powerful tool, this pain and pleasure of paying. I guess it's just all about how you apply the tool, which will determine whether or not it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing for society and for individuals as well, and their control and management of their own money.
Yeah, in the past, there used to be some attempts to doing this. There was a firm in the US called Cabela's, retail chain, that basically for outdoor stuff, but their expertise was, and they're actually a newspaper article called like that, it's the store for men who hate to spend money. and they located it only in the outskirts, about 100 miles from any downtown, and it was more about the experiences. And because it was a trip to going there, you took the entire family, so the other persons who loved shopping spent money there, and you were there anyway, so you spent some money even if you didn't like shopping and paying. And that's a way to actually approach things from a win-win perspective. It's not easy, but there may be some successful attempts in that.
Wow.
All right. I think then to end this episode on, Ofer, given all the research that you've done, given all the research that you know, what do you think is the most important finding or the key message to have come out of the research on the pain of paying? Like, what is the one thing you want our audience to take away from this episode, if nothing else?
I have to go back to what I emphasized in the middle of our podcast, which is the notion and the deep understanding that paying is not an apathetic affair. It's an emotional affair that needs to be understood more deeply. We all know that one person that when we go to a restaurant with never pays. And we call them, the tightwad or whatever. We have nicknames for them. And sometimes we even give up friends like this. Sometimes we keep them because they have other benefits. But if we look at it differently, they actually have the same pain that we all have, but just much, much, much more. Then I think that's the take-home message. That is the thing that got me intrigued back then. And I think that's the thing that's still the take-home message today, because all the rest is technicalities that will change with technology. But that's a very deep notion. May change in degree, but will stay in essence.
Wow. This has been an incredibly fascinating discussion. So thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, amazing. Well, if the listener wants to find out more about what you're doing and your research, can we find you anywhere online?
LinkedIn, Facebook by my name. Also, Ofer at ono.ac.il. I'm very accessible and I'll be happy to. Every now and then on ResearchGate, PhD students ask me for advice and comments on pain of paying. So it does happen, but if it happens more, for sure, no problem.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Oh, Sarah and Merle, thank you. And I hope the quarantine ends soon and invite you to come to Israel and hug in person.
Amazing.
Oh, I'll come. I'm ready for a holiday once we're finally allowed to leave the country or the house. Well, thank you so much for these absolutely great answers, Ofer. I think there's a lot of things to actually take away from this episode. Sarah, what is the main thing that you've learned?
Well, I think that as the context of how we spend money and the methods of money that we are using has changed so much over the past 30 years, it's going to be difficult to apply research done back in the 90s to what's happening today. So I guess that just means more research needs to be done, which is, I guess, where you come in, Merle. Very valuable.
Actually, yeah, no, very valuable. But when he said, it's very hard to compare research from 30 years ago and make that sound or make that valid in the contemporary society or the contemporary payment scheme, I was like, oh, because it actually makes it more difficult for me to build a conclusive argument that there is a spectrum to place contactless or mobile payments on if that spectrum was created on values held about 30 years ago. So it's an interesting debate. Kind of broke my heart.
It should fill you with hope. There's a lot still to learn about.
I mean, obviously there's a lot still to learn. I mean, given what we have seen so far, there's probably more payment methods to come out. Ofer, thankfully, is very, very optimistic about a lot of payment methods recoupling rather than further decoupling. Do you think it's likely? Do you think there's going to be more recoupling, or do you think there's going to be more decoupling first? I
think by the end of it, we need to have more recoupling. It's necessary almost, but I can see us decoupling more than we already are, with if Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies become more widely used, I think we'll have a very different relationship with Bitcoin than we would do with contactless or credit cards or debit cards. These payment methods which have already kind of been established and widely used and accepted, for the last, would you say 20 years, 30, 40, 50 years even?
Credit cards been around since the 60s. Contactless has been around since just before the century switch, which most people don't know because it got popularized in the 2010s, but it was around a decade before that.
Yeah, and even though it seems like cash is, the most promising method when it comes to which method is going to invoke the largest pain of paying, for self-control reasons, we did also talk about what the downsides of having a cash economy are, right? This idea of, more corruption, more illegal activity. So potentially it's not a bad thing necessarily that we are moving away from cash completely.
No, but as you mentioned before, we're seeing the same black market activity with crypto. So then the future is neither cash and the future is not crypto either. So maybe what Ofer has given us is a small glimpse into a future where we are dealing with a new, nicely recoupled currency, which doesn't allow for corruption of any form, of black market activity for any form. It sounds a bit Big Brother to me, if I'm being completely honest, but maybe that is the future. Who knows?
The future is recoupled.
The future needs to be recoupled because otherwise we are fucked.
Yeah, and we look forward to finding out how that's going to happen, I guess. It's a mystery to all of us.
Yes, within the next, from this date onward, we're currently recording this section on the 23rd of April 2020. On the 23rd of April 2040, 20 years later, we'll keep you posted on all the massive changes that have happened in the payment landscape.
Yeah, I hope we make it to 2040.
We're young and healthy. I think we should manage.
Okay, well, if we make it to 2040, let's do another episode where we reflect back on the last 20 years.
I'll put it in my Google Calendar.
Okay, perfect.
Solid.
All right.
All right, guys. Well, that has been the episode on questioning the pain of paying. We hope you learned something cool today. We hope this was useful to you in any way. The next episode will be uploaded next Monday, so we hope to see you back then. And I hope you stay questioning everything. I hope you stay a great fan of behavioral science, and that's effectively it for this episode.
Yeah, and stay safe.
Stay safe.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Questioning Behaviour. Tune in to our next episode to find out which behaviour we will be questioning next.
A podcast is a bit of a one-way medium. We're talking to you, but you can't actually talk back. If you'd like a more interactive exchange, do reach out to us via our socials. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Just look for Questioning Behaviour. We're also on Twitter using @QB_podcast. We're looking forward to hearing from you. See ya!
Bye!